Hi guys, welcome back to Binge Watch Britney. So for today's episode, we are going to be covering Safe Home on Hulu. And just to go ahead and get it out there, I do want to add a trigger warning. This TV show does deal with domestic violence, so if that is something that you're sensitive to, this episode may not be for you. So I want to talk a little bit about why I was drawn to watch this show, and it's mainly because of the actress Aisha Dee, who is someone who was in the TV show The Bold Type. And I was really surprised when I actually started watching this show because I didn't realize that the actress had a Australian accent. I think maybe I knew that she was Australian, but when she was in The Bold Type, she didn't have an accent. And so coming from that TV show to this TV show, the accent just completely threw me off. And then obviously in like the title and the credits, or it does reference Australia. So this is an Australian TV show. And so obviously if you're watching the show, you will notice some difference in like how they talk about where they live. They talk about I think states and like territories or something like that. And then also just how they reference domestic violence. They call it family violence in this particular part of Australia. It goes without saying that family violence, domestic abuse is a heavy topic, no matter what aspect of it that you're talking about. And a lot of what I saw on this TV show reminded me of the TV show Made on Netflix. That was just really brutal for me to watch and really traumatizing and triggering. And so I kind of had a similar experience with watching this TV show to where I just felt it just made me really empathize with the characters and what they were going through. And it also really just hit home how scary it is that people can be so deceptive that you don't even know what they're really like behind closed doors. So, with all of that being said, let's go ahead and get into the rest of the episode. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with the 5 key points. So the first key point is that Phoebe starts a new job. So we know that Phoebe is in communications, she's a journalist, she is working for this McKinley and something, maybe Presley law firm, and for whatever reason she's starting a new job. I'm assuming that she left because of the affair that she was having with Julian, who is married. His wife also works at that law firm, and so anyway, we see had a goodbye party. She's starting her new job. And when she gets to the location, they tell her, hey, you're not supposed to be here. You're supposed to meet Jenny at this location, the magistrate court. And so she rushes there. They have a little mix up and they realize that they thought that she was Liv, but she's actually Phoebe. And so I was really annoyed by this because they really didn't do any questioning or trying to get any further context about who Phoebe was. They just assumed that they had the wrong name for someone who was a duty lawyer. So with that being said, Phoebe should not have been put in the position that she was in. And so because Jenny was overwhelmed, Phoebe had to take over with questioning the victims who were filing the intervention order, which I think is the equivalent of a restraining order in America. And so she was having to interview with these people, and she was going to interview a woman named Sherry. And I'm not sure if it's Sherry or if it's Cherry. I think I said Sherry, though I'm not sure. Anyway, she was supposed to go meet Sherry, but on the way up, she ran into this guy who was really friendly. He was well dressed, so I at first thought that he was a lawyer. And so when she's trying to go into this room that's securely locked, you need to swipe a card in order to unlock the door. He deceives her and then he sprints in and he's just banging on the glass walls and things like that. And he's obviously trying to intimidate his wife who is there trying to get protection from him. And that was a really scary moment because you see the woman Sherry yelling and screaming in the office. She's trying to get as far away from him as she can. And then you have Phoebe who's kind of frozen and not reacting. And it's just a really scary situation all around. Luckily, they were able to get the guy away from Sherry and get him off of that floor. But it really just hits home how intense these situations are. And one thing I want to highlight is that with Sherry, we see that language is a huge issue. There is a language barrier because I think she speaks Cantonese. I hope I said that correctly. and she doesn't speak any English. So we see her having trouble understanding people who are speaking English. We see them having trouble communicating with her. And then we even see her daughter trying to translate some things for her. And what really hit home for me was, obviously because I have people repeat stuff to me all the time. And what really hit home for me was this scene where the daughter is translating what the principal is saying to her mom, who is also on the phone call. And the principal is reprimanding the mom and saying, "You need to put your children first." And the daughter hears this and she understands what she's saying to her mother, but she rephrases it or just completely changes what the principal said and tells her mom, "Hey, you're doing a good job, you're doing your best," or whatever. And so it was really sad that that little child knew that what was being said to her mother was a little bit too harsh, and she was able to soften the approach to her mother because she really was doing the best that she could. You saw that she had this kind of like crappy job. Her boss was rude. He was just really rude, really not controlling, but he was just really on top of her and just giving her a hard time. And so she obviously was not in the best position. And then we know that her husband's mother also plays a role in everything that's happening because she immediately takes her son's side and accuses Sherry of being the problem. And then we also learn that the new place that Phoebe is working, which is called FLVS, is the Family Violence Legal Center. And so we know right away that this place is at risk of losing their government funding. They're already really tight staffed. They have a lot that they are responsible for, and they just don't have enough people, enough manpower, enough money even to do the things that they need to do in order to help the people who are coming to them. So we know that Phoebe has been hired to kind of generate public interest in as far as promoting what they're doing at the center, but then also getting the government really involved and really seeing the center in a positive light. And so one thing I want to highlight here is that we do have a few different storylines that are happening in addition to the main storyline with Phoebe, Julian, and Grace. And so we are introduced to this character, Mrs. T. We know right away that something is really weird about her dynamic. She's an older woman. Her husband is older as well. And we see her at this convenience store and she's having trouble with her card. We see her call to get the card like fixed or whatever. They said that it was lost, it had been canceled, and they're sending her a new one. She has to wait for her husband to come to the store, swipe his card so that she can purchase whatever it is that she's trying to purchase. And so we see that this scene is really weird because it seems like the husband is controlling the finances that she has access to. And he's also making her look crazy in public to the other people who are witnessing these things happen. And then we also see this scene where I'm not sure why, but it was at nighttime and she ended up leaving her house. They do have horses on their land, so maybe she was going to the barn or something like that. And when she tried to get back to the house, he locked her out. You saw him turn off all the lights and it was raining outside. And I don't know why she didn't just stay in the barn or whatever, but we see her eventually, I guess, making her way to town. I don't know how far she had to walk, but she looked in horrible condition when she finally got to somebody who was able to help her. And we see her being helped by this young, I guess, police officer, and he ends up calling her husband. Her husband comes in, and he's kind of like just brushing the whole thing off as if she was crazy and was wandering off in the middle of the night again when we know that he set that up to happen to her. We also have another situation with Ryan. I'm not sure if her first name is Ryan or whatever it is, but I'm going to refer to her as Ryan. And so she is someone who works at this audio store. She has a coworker, Xander, and we know that she's being abused by her mom. We are introduced to her as she's sleeping in the building where she works, and he kind of catches her there when she's not supposed to be, and he covers for her. And so we're getting the impression that Xander is this cool person who's going to have her back, whatever. And then later on, we see this moment where he kind of understands that she has nowhere to go. And then we do see this moment where her mother comes into the store. She's going off on her. And then she also has a bag of her belongings. And so Ryan denies knowing the woman. The woman cusses her out, and then she drops her stuff. And then Ryan kind of goes to the back to kind of like cool off or whatever. And so we'll obviously see how that plays out. The second key point is that Phoebe outs the top head at the law firm that she was working at. So this is that Presley guy. I hope I'm saying the name correctly. But he's a top figurehead at the law firm. She had reported him for sexual harassment, and so we see her in this conference room. He comes in, he's having a conversation with her. We know right away that this is inappropriate because she, as someone who has reported him, she should not be in a room alone with him. And looking back now, we see how valuable and aware Grace was in this moment, because as Priestley is basically going off on her for reporting him and misreading the situation, we see Grace coming in and she knows right away, hey, this is wrong. Do you need me to stay here? And Phoebe tells her, no, it's okay. I'll come find you later. And so Priestley is talking about how there was other men at that law firm who were worse than he was. And then he says that basically his comment was not that bad. He complimented a woman on the skirt that she was wearing and then asked her if she was wearing underwear, which is completely inappropriate. And so at the beginning of this conversation, we see that Phoebe is obviously uncomfortable, and so she starts recording him while they're having this conversation. And I think it's good that she kind of had Grace leave, because obviously Grace was not caught on recording saying whatever. And obviously, I feel like she would have supported Phoebe given what we know about her now. But I think that that was why she said, Grace, you don't need to be here. It's fine. And then we do see this moment where Priestley calls out Phoebe for sleeping with Grace's husband, and that's like his little dig at her for coming at him. We also see that Xander becomes controlling. He starts criticizing everything that Rye is doing. He at one point tells her, you don't have to wash the dishes, and she's like, no, I want to clean up after myself. And then he's like, well, no, you don't clean the dishes properly. There's gunk on them. I don't want you washing them. And so this is a point where she moves out because she's realizing that the dynamic is weird. It's also weird because just before she moves out, she confronts him kind of in that same conversation of them talking about the dishes. She brings up him changing her shift without asking her, and he directs that they could work more shifts together. And so when she tells him that she doesn't like that, basically, he's like, too bad. I'm the boss. Basically, you have no say. And so we see him really trying to work his way into having control over her. We do see that during the course of them, I guess, living together, that they do start sleeping together, and he is obviously making a point to retaliate against her whenever she does something that he doesn't like. And we do see this scene where it's after she has moved out, and he's talking to someone in the store. She's helping a customer, and they're laughing at something on the TV, and she's really bothered by this, so she goes to see what's on the TV, and she realizes that it's a recording that he made of the two of them, an intimate relation. And so we're seeing how he is manipulating her, controlling her, and really putting her in these compromising positions because he knows that she doesn't really have a support group at this point. We also see Mrs. T sneaking away from the house that she shared with her husband. She ends up going to her sister's, and she talks about wanting to take a bath. The thing that bothered me about Mrs. T is that she was so polite, to the sense where she didn't really want to take anything bad, and she was obviously trying to cover up all of the bad that was happening. And so we do see this scene where eventually her and her sister are watching TV, and the sister's phone just keeps ringing, and it's Mr. T calling, looking for her because he knows that she has run away. And so we do see this conversation where Mrs. T is, trying to get help for leaving her husband, and she's having a call, and they're talking about how it's going to be a 3-year wait for her to find a placement home. And at first she's excited about this, but then when she realizes that this process takes 3 years, which is ridiculous, nobody should have to wait that long for a safe place to live. And for whatever reason, I guess, I don't know if it was that she wasn't comfortable at her sister's or she didn't want to impose, but she would rather sleep in her car than stay at her sister's. And so we do see this moment where Mr. T eventually finds her in her car, and she ends up going back to him. And then we see this moment where Mr. T, Mrs. T, and their granddaughter are interacting, and the granddaughter asks Mrs. T, hey, are you crazy? And so we know that the grandfather, Mr. T, is obviously saying stuff and doing stuff in such a public way to make people think that Mrs. T is crazy. And it's sad because he's conditioning this little girl to buy into that narrative that he is putting out there. The third major point that happens is we see Phoebe breaking down over her breakup with Julian. They I don't know how long they have been dating, but at this point, it's been 3 weeks since they broke up. She sees him at a party at a bar that she had gone to with Jenny. She ended up seeing Priestley approach Grace, and she thought maybe he's telling Grace about them. And so she breaks his glass in her hand. She has to go to the hospital. Her and Julian kind of reunite, and they kind of get closer again. And then I think they have some sort of thing happen where Phoebe can't get in touch with him, and so she ends up going to his house drunk, and she realizes that he's never going to leave Grace. And just prior to this, we had a moment where Grace came to the center. She approached Phoebe, and you really thought that she was going to confront Phoebe about having an affair with her husband, but she's actually revealing to them, hey, your funding is going to be cut. Let's do everything we can to stop this. And during that conversation, Grace is congratulated for getting the senior partner role, and she asks Phoebe to keep it quiet. And so we see this conversation with Phoebe and Julian, and she tells him, oh, you need to leave Grace. She's going to be fine. She got the senior partner role. She has nothing to be unhappy about. And so this is, I think, a really big moment in this series, because I think that this is what led to the fight that Julian and Grace had that took place over the last two or three episodes. And going into the fourth point, we see that there is an IBO for Julian against Grace. So this means that Julian needs to be protected from Grace. And so we see that Julian has scratches on his neck, and so we see him being submissive towards Grace, and so we're thinking, or we're led to believe that he is the victim, and Grace is this crazy, aggressive person who is either attacking him for their affair or because she has other mental health issues. And so Phoebe is responsible for going over the conflict schedule or something like that. I can't recall the correct terminology. She sees their name on the list and she realizes, okay, this is really serious. Julian needs protection from Grace. What's going on? And so she immediately thinks that he's the victim. And then we also see, like, when they're going to the court case, we see that Julian and Grace are supposed to be united on this. They can't arrive at the court together, so they have to drive separately. And then for some reason, Grace is supposed to resign, and then they're going to go to court and try to get everything dismissed. And so when they're at court, Grace has not arrived yet. We see Phoebe interacting with a reporter friend, Layla, and she realizes that Layla's there to do a story on the case, and she's trying to do everything she can to get Layla to drop the story on Julian and Grace. And so she ends up giving Layla the recording of Priestley outing him for his behavior towards women at the law firm. We do see this moment where they are actually in the process of talking about the case in court. Julian's again trying to get it dismissed. Grace hasn't arrived, and he's kind of like freaking out. And then we see him saying, I need to stand up for myself. I need to be protected from Grace. I don't know what she's going to do next. And so this is a really huge moment because, again, we're led to believe that Grace is the problem. And then we're obviously seeing two things play out that are kind of happening kind of like at the same time. And so we know that Grace is supposed to show up at the hearing, but she doesn't. And so what we see is her at the law firm. She's supposed to talk to Priestley to resign. Instead, she says, Julian's sick, he's not going to make it. And then we see her kind of looking at a picture of the two of them, and she's laughing, kind of like it's not like a true laughter. It's just kind of like like she just had like an aha moment. And so we see her leave her phone. She ends up going to her house, and what I was really confused by is because at first I didn't know where she was, but we see her kind of like crawling on the floor, and at first I was like, did something happen to her legs? What's going on? Is she being attacked? Whatever. And so we see her crawling on the floor. She gets to this little box, and it looks like she unplugged something. Then we see her go into a office in the home, and she's watching the recording that was on the camera nearby to where she was crawling. And so we see it play back what actually happened that night, and we see Julian choking Grace, and we realize that he is the one who attacked her. And then I don't know why this is shocking, because I would assume that she was aware of the camera, and so I didn't really understand that, but it was valuable in showing that Julian was the aggressor. And so we see at this point that Grace is realizing that everything is really bad, and she needs to basically get away from Julian in order to save her life. And so she left her phone at the office, and she's not using her cards, and she's talking to Eve and telling her, everything's bad. He's tracking me. I need to get away. And As I mentioned, at the same time this is happening, where she's missing, Julian has already retaliated against her in court by claiming that he needs a protection order from her. And then after he's done in court, he's looking for Grace. He's trying to find her. He shows up at the office. He sees her phone. He goes to their house. He sees what she was looking at on the computer, and he is just really, really angry. And then we see this moment where he and Phoebe are having a conversation, because at this point Phoebe has found out that he told Layla about the court case, and obviously she's wondering why he would want that to be public knowledge. And then he's trying to spin it back on her and say, hey, well, you want publicity for family violence. I'm trying to help you. And so she's able to eventually get him to admit to calling Layla, but she's starting to put the pieces together that something is not right here. And the reason why I want to point this next scene out, is just after Julian had made his statement that he needed a protection order against Grace, we see Phoebe in the bathroom crying, and Eve comes in, and Eve asks for an update on what happened, and Phoebe tells her, and then we see Eve go, this effing bastard, basically. And so she's obviously speaking badly of Julian, and so this should kind of tip you off, and it should have tipped Phoebe off to the fact that Julian is not as innocent as he is claiming to be. And the fifth major point is that Julian kills Grace as she is leaving the family violence center. So we see that Grace has gone to Eve for help. She needs Eve to buy her a ticket so she can get out of the area. And what we learn later on in that last episode is that Julian was waiting for her to leave that center, because he was able to figure out where she was, and he ends up killing her. He hits her at a high speed, and then he drives into traffic to kill himself in a murder-suicide. I also want to go ahead and tie up some other scenes that we see happening. We do see Phoebe and Layla getting together, and Layla is showing her the article that she was working on that would be published, and it's basically exposing, I think, because she got Layla to change the story from the court case between Julian and Grace to the fact that there was sexual harassment at the law firm. And so I'm not sure what exactly Phoebe reads in the article, but she goes off on Layla because I guess there's something about another girl that he was tracking or something. I couldn't really understand it, but Layla is realizing that that girl was Phoebe, and so Phoebe is mad because she's like, if you had told me, I would have known, and I could have stopped this, I could have saved her, whatever. And so we really see Phoebe kind of like breaking down, because she is realizing how deceived she was, and thinking that Julian was the bad guy, and that Grace was actually the victim this whole time, and she never really was able to see that. And then the other storylines that I want to clear up is we see Sherry finally standing up to her husband and her mother-in-law, and she calls him out in court as an abuser. So we do see that she has had this horrible experience with her husband in court. He keeps dragging her to court. She can't afford it. She's also having to take off work to go to court. She has to find childcare for her kids. And we do see this moment where her kids are left at home by themselves because the babysitter can't stay longer. And then we see this woman from like basically Child Protective Services comes to her house, finds out that the kids are alone, and then she ends up having the kids call their grandmother to come and get them. And so we see what the kids are taking away from her. So at this point, when she's going to her last court case that we see, she is contacted while she's on the bus, and her daughter says, grandma says don't say anything bad about dad in court, or you won't be able to see us again. And so it's really good that she was able to stand up to him in court despite all of this threats and the stuff that he was putting her through. We also get some resolution with Mrs. T. We know that she went back to her husband, and we see her in the car. I don't know what has happened, but she just looks really out of it, and she's approached by the same cop who helped her earlier, and he's like, hey, do I need to call anyone for you, whatever. And then we do see her later on at the family violence center with a few of the other women who have been part of this season. And so thing to conclude from that is that she was willing to take another chance to get away from her husband. We also see Rye's storyline tied up a little bit. We know that her boss fired Xander for that stunt of playing the video at the store, and then we know that Rye was stealing from the store, so she's given him some of the money back. And then he ends up seeing her wrist, and then she has to admit to him that her mom is abusing her because he thinks that Xander is the one who caused the bruises. And so we see him realizing everything that she's going through. And then what we see at the very end is we see Mrs. T, Rye, Sherry, all at the Family Violence Center getting the help that they need. And then just to tie up one loose end here, we know that Eve is kind of like distraught over Grace's death because they were really close. She knew everything that was happening between Grace and Julian, and she is deciding to step away from the Family Violence Center. And Jenny is in charge now. She's the CEO, and so that is just how the season ends. So to go ahead and wrap up this episode, I just want to highlight how intense all of this was to watch. There were so many different reasons for why that was. We went through so many different scenarios where we saw that the women were powerless, they were helpless, and they were just in these circumstances where they had no control over what was happening to them, what was being done to them. But I'm really proud of all of these women for getting the help that they needed, for going to the Family Violence Center and advocating for themselves and speaking up to their abusers. And I think this show really highlights how deceptive abuse can be, because you thought Xander was a good guy, you thought Julian was a good guy, but then you realize that they're horrible men, and they were so veiled in the abuse of their partner that most people would not have seen it. And so I think this show did a good job of just highlighting how deceptive everything can be when it comes to abuse, and you never really know what you're looking at. And so I'm glad that this show shed light on domestic violence. This show also shed light on the fact of what it's like to be the other woman, because after seeing this, no one should want to be the other woman, because you never know what's actually going on in someone's relationship. So like for Phoebe, how she was the other woman when it came to Julian and Grace and stuff like that, and so she was just believing everything that Julian was saying, and she was completely blind to everything that he was doing to Grace. And so she easily, if he had left Grace, could have become his next victim, and she wouldn't have really been, she might have been better equipped to handle it because she would have been at the Family Violence Center and had resources, but she wouldn't have seen it coming because he was so wrapped up in believing Julian's narrative of everything that was happening. And so I was really glad that she quickly wised up to all of these different facts in front of her that was telling her that something wasn't lining up. And so I'm really glad that she had that moment with Grace where Grace was at Eve's office and it was just her, and Phoebe came in, and they had this moment where they made it clear that Grace knew that Phoebe was sleeping with her husband, and she was okay with it. Like, she didn't wish ill on Phoebe for doing that, and she was really trying to kind of like encourage her to, I guess, accept everything that was happening and the truth about Julian, because she was deceived too. And so I'm really glad that they had that moment between the two of them before Grace was killed, because Phoebe would have had a lot of guilt knowing that she contributed even more so to everything that was happening, because she was the one who told Julian about the senior partner offer. And then can you imagine if when she was on the phone with Julian asking him about Layla, Grace came in and he was looking for Grace, she could have easily told him where Grace was, and then she also could have told him about the plane ticket. And so I'm glad that Phoebe really wised up to everything that was happening and was on the right side of things by the end. And yeah, so to go ahead and wrap up this episode, if you haven't checked out Safe Home and you want to do so because of this episode, I definitely encourage you to do so. And yeah, thank you guys for listening. I'll see you in the next one.